Hey everyone, Happy New Year. Welcome to another episode of Antidotes, Stories, and Medicine. I am your host, Christine. I hope you guys enjoyed last week's episode with Sonia. And this week is another special episode done in collaboration with the guys from Just Some Podcast. It is a podcast for advanced practitioners. So nurse practitioners, midwives, clinical nurse specialists, PAs, etc. And really anyone that likes medicine. These guys are really fantastic. They sat down with me, and by sat down, I mean sat down in their respective houses all over the country, and we just chatted about how we became nurse practitioners. We all started out as first responders. They were cops. Obviously, I worked in EMS. So we had that kind of commonality, and we just chatted about how we decided to get into nursing. And it definitely wasn't the most traditional path. And so we wanted to kind of just talk about that. And their podcast is awesome. They talk a little bit more about educational stuff as opposed to mine, which is very obviously story-based, and I interview other people. They have some really great information. Their podcast is really informative, and they do a lot on medical education and things like billing and the effects of alcohol and all this other stuff that I just don't cover in my podcast. So if you're really interested in medicine but want something that's more educational, I would definitely check them out. They're obviously really great guys, as you can hear from this episode. So take a listen to them. And if you want to hear more, check them out wherever you listen to podcasts. They're called Just Some Podcasts, and you can find them on social media as well. And of course, I will be coming back in the new year with all new stories. James from The Flying Snake will be back with more stories. He's a little ragged from PA school, but I did snag him for some time to tell some more stories with me, and it was a really good episode. So I'm really looking forward to that. And of course, there's so many more things, so many more guests that are coming in the new year. So please keep leaving reviews, please subscribe, and please keep sharing the podcast on social media. It really helps, and I really appreciate it. All right. I hope you guys enjoy this crossover episode.
So tonight, Miss Christine, welcome to our podcast, and we are so happy to be on yours.
Welcome to my podcast.
Yes, ma'am. Hey, I feel the same way. I'm like, oh, I don't know. Like, this is like the dual podcast episode. So I'm like, whatever. It's both cool. Fine. We're on yours. So
it's a podcast off. It's a nurse practitioner podcast off.
Boom. There you go.
Hi, guys.
How are you doing, ma'am?
I am well. How are you? How was your weekend?
Well, I worked all weekend. I got up 7 o'clock this morning, so I'm still kind of dragging ass a little bit, but, you know, the joys of working ER sometimes.
I had to work part of the weekend. I actually worked when one of our episodes came out, and one of my techs saw it on Facebook, downloaded our podcast, and listened to it sitting next to me. And it was one of the more embarrassing moments of my life. I mean, in a good way. I chuckled, but she was literally crying in her seat, laughing and yelling quotes from the show at me. So it was an interesting Saturday. We'll put it that way.
And so for people that are listening to this on my podcast, which is Antidotes, Stories, and Medicine, what is your podcast?
We are Just Some Podcast.
Which I had talked about before in one of my episodes. You guys are a nurse practitioner podcast, and your recent episode was about blood alcohol content. Is that right?
Yeah, we talked about, the short-term and long-term effects of alcohol, and we, at the time, thought it would be a great idea to get intoxicated while doing that. Didn't work out so well. We ended up having to reshoot half of it, because the latter half of it, we got rather intoxicated, and yeah, it wasn't great.
I think that's a perfect example of why you shouldn't do things intoxicated. So I think you kind of proved your hypothesis there a little bit.
Well, we feel that way, but at the same time, most of our feedback has been, dude, you have got to do that again. And I'm like, nah, I don't think so. But so far it's been at least positive. But it was a interesting experience. And most I think it was Hemingway said, always do things sober that you said you do drunk. Like, this was a definite, oh yeah, this will teach you to keep your mouth shut when you're intoxicated. Hear yourself recorded and blasted out on a podcast will definitely open your eyes about what you sound like.
Yeah, I think a drunk nurses podcast or a drunk nursing nurse practitioner podcast is probably a little bit dangerous for the licensure and liability part of our profession.
Well, yeah, I guess if we were, yes, repeat it, yes. I was gonna say, like, we took extra precautions to make sure we didn't cross any lines, but just listening to yourself, you're like, yeah. I think I'm gonna drink at home alone now. Like, no more going out. So.
A sobering experience. Well, it's in my lineup for podcasts. All my podcasts that I like to listen to come out on Thursdays, so I get like inundated, and then I have to catch up on them by Wednesday again. I'm just out of them, so I'll have to listen to it on my commute tomorrow. I have a cushy primary care hours, so I did not work this weekend.
Well, for the most part, I work in a primary care office, but I work like the walk-in section, so I get that rotating every so many Saturdays. So it's not been too bad. It's still definitely a better schedule than when I was a staff ER nurse.
Oh yeah. I mean, I worked on the ambulance, and that was just hell on earth as far as scheduling goes. We're recording this a week before Christmas, and I used to work so many Christmases. And Christmas and New Year's are always on the same day of the week. So if your shift is on Saturdays, you are hitting both of those holidays, and it sucked. So I feel you, everyone out there that's working.
Yeah, staff nurse, and then I was a police officer before this, and both professions just do not lend themselves to banker's hours. So if you're working it, if you're a staff nurse, police officer, paramedic, firefighter, I feel for you. I've been in your shoes. I am sorry, and hopefully you don't have to work every holiday. That's about it.
I liked working New Year's Day, though. That was my favorite one because you got holiday pay, but everyone was hungover and they were in bed and they weren't up to anything. And so you just basically got to do nothing. Everything was closed and got paid pretty well for it. So that was my favorite. But usually I came to working Christmas.
Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, football, sure, if you wanted to.
I was gonna say that's the one drawback is if your team's good enough to be in a New Year's Day bowl, you know that old lady is going to call about her trash can lids missing, and if you're a cop or something like that, and you were going to be out doing a patrol when you should be at the station watching a football game, it always bitches somehow.
So my podcast knows a little bit about my background, but you guys are DNPs, and I actually have not talked about the DNP. You're both DNPs, is that correct?
Not yet. I am looking at some DNP programs. However, Ben is the one to talk about DNPs.
Yeah, actually, 2 years ago to the day, it was the day I walked across the stage and got my doctorate, and we were the first cohort from my university to get our doctorate in like the 113-year history of the university.
Yay! Congratulations!
Thanks.
Happy anniversary of DNPing. If that's a thing. So explain what the DNP is, because this kind of baffles a lot of people, patients, even other nurses.
So the DNP is basically just the terminal degree for nurse practitioners. I started out with my master's, and at the time, the college that I went to or the university that I went to did not have the doctoral program. And when they introduced it, they called me up and said, hey, would you be interested in this? And there was something about it that just told me I needed to do it. And so I did. And it does add some additional schoolwork aspects to it, the paper writing and things of that nature. But I did get to do an additional clinical rotation, and I did mine through radiology. And so that helped me tremendously, both in the primary care office, but also in the ER, as to sit there and, I kind of likened it to, if you remember back in like the 90s, the pictures in the malls where like you had to stare at the thing long enough and the image would just kind of appear. That's how it was for me reading like CAT scans until I sat with a radiologist for hours and hours. He started pointing things out, and I'm like, that makes sense now. Like, I see it. So I think it was great for me.
I love looking at radiology. Whenever I have images that I get to pull up, I just think it's so cool, and trying to figure out the puzzle. It would be great if someone actually gave me the answers and sitting next to them. That's really cool. I didn't know that there was even DNP programs that have a radiology focus.
Well, we got to choose a specialty, and I knew that was one that I was weak in, and so that's why I chose that.
Sure. Everyone always asks me, like, what is that and what's a PhD? And I try and explain that the DNP for nurse practitioners is to a PhD as is the MD to PhD for physicians. It's the clinical doctorate, sort of, although it doesn't really change our scope of practice.
Doesn't really change our scope of practice, and doesn't really It doesn't. I mean, it impacts what I do in that I have more education and training behind it, but as far as my day-to-day activities, it's basically the same, other than it's just a clinical doctorate versus a PhD.
Do people call you doctor at work?
I personally, I mean, I could go by that as long as I end it with, like I'm Dr. Ben, nurse practitioner.
Right.
I don't. It's still a touchy subject, and I don't want to piss people off.
Yeah.
That I work with, so it's just easier to not do that. I still have patients that do it, and for them, I don't. I mean, like kids and things like that, but for the most part, no, not really.
It is such a touchy subject, and I get kind of pissed off, and I don't have a DNP, but it's like, if you went to school for a doctorate of anything else and you're working in that role, in that profession, with that doctorate, you would be called doctor. But just because other people have doctorates in something else, also called doctor, it's not culturally appropriate to be called doctor. Like, makes me like, yeah, I'm not really like okay with it. Like, if you had a doctorate of basket weaving and I was taking your basket weaving course, I would address you with the credentials that you have earned and also paid a lot of money for, like doctor of basket weaving,
I like
respectfully. And people are like, oh, nurse practitioners want to be physicians and be called doctors. Like, no, I want to be a doctor being a nurse practitioner. That's why I did it. Like,
exactly.
Yeah. There is an oncologist in the area that has a nurse practitioner that works for them that has a doctorate, and she is referred to as such doctor. And I had a patient who was notorious, and she was like, I'm going to see Dr. Smith or whatever, the nurse practitioner. And she kind of made this snide comment of, she's not really a doctor. And I was just like, oh, God. But anyways, I could rant about that. But that's not why we're here.
Maybe we should talk to Christine again when we do the education episode, when we get on to some of that information. Because honestly, one, I feel the exact same way. And two, I'm also still struggling because I have decided I want to get that advanced degree work, that I'm looking at those aspects. Which would be more advantageous? Do I go to the PhD for the research aspects? Do I go for my DNP for the clinical aspects? It's one of those things I'm still looking at for both. I think I'm settling. I shouldn't say settling. I think I've chosen the DNP, but it's still something I'm working back and forth on. But ultimately, those are some of the same things I think about is, well, one, why am I doing it? And two, is this really going to be worth it in the end, dealing with those little things? Because those little things, honestly, bother me more than big things. And it annoys me.
Yeah. I know I would like to go back for a doctorate, and if I would ever go, it would be for a DNP. I'm not a huge research person. I love the clinical part of my job. I love it. It's just really expensive. I have my student loans that I'm still paying off. I'm relatively new in practice. I mean, I never use my GI Bill, so I may use my GI Bill to pay for a DNP at some point, but I'm just so busy right now. I don't have the time to do it. So maybe in the future, I'll use that GI Bill.
So tell me, so obviously you were military. Was your military background involved in medical field, or were you in some other MOS?
So I was a medic. I was a reservist. So I didn't deploy. We did some medical missions and things, nothing combat, but it was really great training though, to do combat medicine training. That's a weird way. To learn TC3, so tactical combat casualty care, and what a field hospital does. It was really, really interesting to add on. So basically, my background is that I got my EMT in high school because they offered it, and that was great. And then I went to college, and I was like, I'm going to be pre-med because everyone told you that you should go to medical school because you're smart, and you're too smart to be a nurse. You don't want to wipe ass, right? And so I got a biology degree, and I hated it, and I was miserable. But I worked as an EMT the entire time, and I worked in very urban 911 systems. So I graduated from college with this degree in biology, which like everybody has if you want to get into a medical graduate program. And I was like, what the fuck do I do with my life? And so, like every young 20-something woman, I joined the Army, and it was great. It was just really different, and I did a lot of things I never thought I could do. And then I was like, oh, I'm going to go to their PA program. that didn't happen. And then I came back and found a direct entry nurse practitioner program while I was still working on the ambulance, and then got in there, went back for a second bachelor's in nursing, and then did my master's. So that's kind of how I got into this whole thing. But I love the nursing model. I like it a lot better than that medical model. I just think it's a little bit more well-rounded and a little bit more compassionate overall.
So I'm curious what 20-something females you were hanging out with that...
I may have been a little facetious there.
I'm like, wait a minute.
I have a very dry sense of humor.
No, I liked it. I was just like, I've known a few.
That was a joke. A bad joke.
No, it's funny because Ben and I can see each other over, the phone, and we both looked at each other like, okay, I not the 20-year-old females I have met. That doesn't mean they're not capable, but that's certainly not the route most of them were picking. So
yeah, that's why I say that.
Now, were you always interested, or was this something the recruiter magic mojo worked on you, or was it something like, no, you knew this is the field you wanted to go into?
Oh no, not at all. Oh, you mean for like the military?
Yeah, like going to the military, like because they do offer a wide variety of jobs, and more than once I have met people that were like, well, I didn't want to do this job, but this is what I was told. And they got into it. Now, I understand you had your EMT before this, but I was just wondering, like, did you really want to go signal intelligence? And somehow they're like, oh, you're an EMT. Yeah, you could just go be a medic. And you were like, okay, whatever. Like, I didn't know if that was, like, your ultimate goal.
Oh, yeah. So I had no desire to join the military until about 2 months before I did it. I'm a very, like, when I know I want to do something, I do it. And even if I was not planning to do it beforehand, kind of like this podcast, I was just like, I'm going to start a podcast. And I did it. And I was in paramedic school. So I graduated college. I started paramedic school. And one of my classmates had been a medic in the Army. And he had been to Iraq and everything. And he's a really nice guy. And he was like, oh, they have a PA program. Because I was doing paramedic school kind of just to do something else before I went to PA school and figure out my life a little bit. And so I said, okay, well, I'll go and talk to a recruiter. And I went to the recruiter and I said, I want to be a medic. I love pre-hospital medicine. I love emergency medicine. I thought it was great. And the recruiter was like, well, we've got all these other jobs. We don't have just medics. We have medics that are also nurses, LPNs, actually. It was like this dual job. But it was, the medic program is 16 weeks for AIT, which is your job school. But the LPN medic, at the time, now they're separate jobs. It was 16 weeks plus a year. And my goal was to, like, as soon as you finish AIT, you can apply to PA school. So I was like, well, I don't want to do that. And like, no one wanted to do the LPN job. So they were just telling you that there was no slots for the solo medic. And I said, too fucking bad. I'm not signing unless you get me what I want. And I got really, really good scores on the ASVAB, which is the testing to get into the military, which made sense because I literally just graduated from college with a biology degree. So, like, yeah, I mean, I did a little bit better than an 18-year-old out of high school. So I walked out of their office and I got a phone call half an hour later and they're like, oh, we found a medic slot for you. And I was like, oh, that's a fucking miracle. Great. So I got what I wanted.
It's amazing the motivation they get sometimes.
Yeah, no, I mean, he wasn't like a bad guy. It was just like, look, I'm not an 18-year-old from high school. Like, I know what I want. I want this. You have it. Give it to me. I'm not going to be fucked with. So yeah, so then I did that. And because I had the EMT already, combat medic school is, the first half is EMT basic. It's a national registry part of the course. And then you go on to additional skills as a combat medic. So combat medics have this weird additional amount of training that is almost like an EMT advanced. We used to call it intermediate, but it's not quite a paramedic. They don't have the medical training that paramedics get. They don't have the cardiology and the diabetic emergencies management that you would get in paramedic school. It's not nearly that, but you can do surgical crikes. You can do needle chest decompressions. You're really good at managing traumas. And so you learn that in addition to the EMT stuff. And you do it in the field and they're shooting blanks above your head and you're up all night and you're doing all these war games and you're also learning a lot of infantry tactics because a lot of medics go to infantry platoons. And so it was really cool. It was just a very, very, very different thing than what I had been doing before.
Well, I grew up an Army brat. I was around the military my entire life until I moved out on my own. And I was really considering the very first thing I really wanted to do was in the medical field, anyways, was CRNA. And I was really looking at the Army for that. Because, like you said, there's a lot of opportunities. And I was thinking, hey, I go in, they pay for my school, I get this experience opportunity, I come out debt free. Seems like a pretty good idea. And I did ROTC and loved it. But like I said, my father and my stepmother are career military officers, and I got the inside track, and I started thinking to myself, and that's kind of why I backed out. I was just like, I saw the inside, and they were like, when they started, it was one way, and they're like, so they kind of gave me their perspective, and I just decided to go my own way. And sometimes I regret it, I'm not going to lie, but much love to everybody that's in the military or that has served. It's a great honor to speak to you and know that you went that way.
It's not for everybody, but it's a really great experience. It's a great leadership experience for people that it is right for. So I ended up being an NCO, which I think as a young female is also a really cool thing to get to just have that experience. Standing in the front of a platoon as a woman is a cool thing. But the coolest thing I probably ever did was in the last year that I was in the reserves, we did this medical mission, and I was a medic, but I had finished nurse practitioner school. I was licensed and just still a medic in the reserves because your civilian job doesn't change what you do in the military. And this happens a lot with the reserves. You do something completely different in the civilian world than what you do in the Army world. And it's this big multi-site humanitarian mission. So it's actually a disaster preparedness drill that they do every year. And we do a lot of like disaster preparedness drills, but usually we have like fake patients. So instead of doing that, these civilian organizations are like, well, look, we're doing all these drills. Why don't we actually treat people? That way we know how things actually run and we can actually do some good for people. So it's like this 5-day event, and they've been doing it for probably almost 30 years at this point. And so I went down there and I got teamed up as just being the medic for the chief medical officer, who was this really nice guy who was a colonel in National Guard or whatever, was down there. And he's like, what do you do in the civilian world? I go, oh, I'm a nurse practitioner. And he goes, oh, well, you're a nurse practitioner this week. And I was like, okay, well, that's not my job in the military, but and I was like, well, I just graduated. And he goes, well, you're going to kind of like be working as my resident. And it was the first time I had been like out of training, and our site alone saw probably, I want to say 3,000 people.
Wow.
So before they made me working as a clinician, there was 8 providers for 3,000 people. So then I made it to 9. But the way the military works is I was a sergeant, but the nurses are captains and majors. Yeah. They're officers. So the nurses that ended up working for me really outranked me. But they were really cool, and they were really respectful of my degree. And we were working like 16-hour days. People would camp out the night before to get in line to get this free care. It was primary care was the only care of any kind they would get all year. And so you would write scripts for metformin for a year, and they would come back the next year, and they would just start crying when they would see you. And it was like the craziest thing that I've ever seen. And I would never have done it without the Army. So it's just, you get to do things like that. I don't think people know that the military does a lot of humanitarian missions, but they do.
That's cool.
I would say my father was involved in some UN mission work with multinational force observers in Egypt and then East Timor. And so he was down there for a lot of that. And hearing some of those stories, honestly, is part of what made me go, it wasn't the final straw that broke the camel's back, but it was definitely part of the, like, what could I be doing more with my life when I'm listening to these stories about similar things. Like he was talking about people that would walk for like 2 weeks to get to a medical camp in these foreign countries that they were setting up to do all this work. And I was like, man, I feel like there's something more I should be doing than, eating a Big Mac. So that's kind of where I was for a while. And then I hear these stories. I'm like, well, I'm glad. I think I'm on the right road, but I've never been involved in something quite that large scale.
Yeah, and this was one of 5 sites, and there was people that it was open to anybody. And we would get threatened by the cartels because people would also this was in the United States, because we were treating people that would even come from Mexico. And of course, there's all that controversy of, should American money be treating Mexicans? And it's like, look, if you want to drag your child across a border for medical care, I'm a nurse practitioner. I'm going to treat you because you're a human.
Yeah.
And people they were bringing their kids to be treated because they just thought the U.S. Army doctors were better. And they were just crying and hugging me and saying, "Thank you, doctor," in Spanish. And this, of course, you're not going to go, "Well, actually, I'm a nurse practitioner," because my Spanish is terrible. But but it was just a part of the world in life that I had never even seen before or imagined. But so, yeah, you can do, the Army's not an easy life, but you can do some really cool stuff, especially in the medical command. But you guys were both cops before, so you had a little bit of paramilitary kind of existence, I guess, beforehand. Is that true?
Yeah, we both were. I'll let Ben speak a little more to his experience, and then I can go over mine.
So I actually, the way I got into, I guess, law enforcement, or that aspect of it, was I actually started out as a 911 dispatcher. And I thought it was a great job. I loved it. I loved being on that end and helping take care of people during their emergency. And that's kind of what led me into everything else. But the one thing I didn't like about that was you don't see the end of it. Like for a 911 dispatcher, we take the phone call, we send the ambulance, and then that's all we ever hear. And so I did that, and then for about a year, while I was doing that also, I worked in it for a small police department as a law enforcement officer, and I thought that's what I wanted to do with my life, to do law enforcement. My dad's in law enforcement. My dad's former military. My mom's former military. And so I was kind of following in his footsteps of, let's go the law enforcement route. And I love dispatching, so it seemed like a good fit. Ended up getting out of a bad relationship and kind of toiling in life as it is. And my mom has been a nurse for 25 years now. And one day she sat me down and said, you have the intelligence for nursing, you have the compassion for nursing, just go do it. And that's what led me into starting the nursing program, not having a clue what the hell I was getting into, other than, well, my mom said I could do it, so I'm going to go do it. And I continued.
That's a good mama, though.
Right? Oh, yeah. I mean, it worked out great.
Yeah.
So, finished nursing school, and because of my law enforcement and dispatch experience, I was able to walk into the ER as a brand new nurse. I started Memorial Day weekend because I'm fucking crazy, apparently. Because why would you start on that weekend of all weekends? But walked into the ER green as hell and went kind of from there. But it was that fulfillment of, now I get to know what happens from, the dispatch call through the ambulance, now through the ER. So,
and to let you know, I did know Ben at this point in my life. I was already a police officer, and trust me, and in some ways, I just, oh my God, I look back and I wonder what I was thinking. But man, I used to give him holy fucking hell about being a nurse. I was like, oh my God, you pansy ass male nurse. Like I could not give him enough shit, because there I was, Danner boots, full dress uniform. I was like, nah, man, I'm going to be a cop forever. You can't stop me. And I'd come in and make fun of him. I'm like, oh my God, how are you doing today, little lady? And all this stuff just to give him hell. And then one day I was like, oh yeah, I think I'm going to do that. So it's weird how the world turns sometimes on you like that. But yeah, I come from a long line of military and lots of police officers. The town I live in, there's several, or the town and the county above me, several police officers that are family members. It's just something, and we talked about it a little bit pre-show. I enjoy being a nurse, but I think being a cop is somewhat still in my DNA. Like, there's just that part of you that feels like a duck in water when you're doing that. And I knew I wanted to do it, and I did some really interesting jobs. I was a drill instructor for a shock incarceration camp. I did a whole bunch of other stuff, and that was super fun. But then I finally got my dream and started at a police department. I, too, got dispatch certified just because that department required all rookies had to be dispatch certified just in case. And just kind of worked my way around in the police world there for a while. And I loved it. I got my first degree is in criminal justice because of that. So yeah, had that experience. And honestly, I will be completely truthful. That experience has been immensely helpful to me as a nurse and a nurse practitioner, because I try and tell people when I would train rookie ER nurses or rookie ICU nurses, not that I did a lot of the ICU training, but when I'd work with other rookie ICU nurses, I just didn't really ever freak out or have a problem in any sort of situations, because I'd been in situations where if I made a mistake, I died, or the person in front of me like died. And I try to tell people, like, you're already in the hospital. Like, the doctors are here. You got the equipment. Like, when you're out in the rain and it's in an accident and you're the first one there and the guy's like leg is hanging off, that is the time you should probably be a little more freaked out than during the trauma in the ER. Like, that's not the time to freak out. Like, that's the time to do work.
That is so true. I think having been in EMS, and EMS is not nearly as dangerous as being in law enforcement, but still, when people are pissed off, they see the uniform and they don't really distinguish. You know, I've had people pull guns on me. I've been almost stabbed multiple times and swung at, and usually I'm the smallest person there, so they kind of go for me. And it's, you know, now when someone, you know, something hectic is happening at work, it's like, well, it's not my emergency and no one's trying to stab me right now, so this is fine. Like,
exactly. And I try and tell them, especially new ER nurses during like their first code, I'm like, relax. You are not the one that's going to die. Okay. So you need to focus on what's going on. Okay. Versus when I was training rookie police officers, I was like, oh no, you might be the one to die. So you need to know what's going on in front of you. And like I said, being a cop, loved giving you guys in EMS and fire a hard time, but it was also like the big brother aspect. And yes, I'm going to say I felt like the cops are the big brothers, because when someone did mess with you guys, all they had to be was like, Tom, it was over. I don't know what was going on, but I guarantee you we were going to squash it real quick, because I got to pick on you guys. Nobody else gets to pick on you guys. That's my job. Like, you know, the drunk guy you're starting an IB on, he doesn't get to make fun of you or pick on you. I get to pick on you. So if he messes with you, I felt like as a police officer, I was like, nah, you don't get to mess with my EMS. Like, I get to mess with the EMS. So I always felt like ultra protective, like on fire scenes. If a firefighter ever actually had to go near a fire, that he wasn't roasting marshmallows over. But if it wasn't something like that, I was like, nah, you don't get to mess with my firefighters. You don't get to mess with my EMS. And so I always enjoyed the camaraderie. And I think sometimes people see like the videos online of cops and firefighters or cops and EMS making fun of each other, but they don't really understand that bond. And again,
no, they don't.
That's also, again, I'm not trying to make this sound like I don't want to be a nurse practitioner. I love being a nurse practitioner. But
yeah, of course.
At the same time, I had this conversation just a couple days ago with somebody that's a firefighter, and I was like, I love what I do. I love the office I'm in. I mean, I work with great people. I could not ask for a better job. But when you go into a house fire, I have been inside a house that is on fire with somebody else, and you almost don't come out. Like, that bond, even if you hate that person, you come out and it's like, no, that's my dude. I might hate him, but that's my dude. And that's part of the thing that you miss in primary care. Like, we all have a great time. And, you know, we went over to so-and-so's house for a weekend party. But at the end of the day, there's that strength of bond that is sometimes lacking.
It's so true. I mean, when I worked on the truck, multiple times my life was saved by PD. And when we would get calls for officer injured or officer down, because I worked in a very urban area, cops got hurt, you know, whether it was a car accident or whatever. Thankfully, I didn't have any cops shot, although they did happen while I was working. I just wasn't at those calls. You know, you drive like hell. And it's just, it is a different feeling than going to any other call. That's one of us, you know, they saved me. I'm going to be there for them, and just, you hold on, and I'm going to do everything I can for you, because this is one of my guys.
And honestly, I felt that way, like Ben in the ER. I know for a time that hospital did not have security. Like, literally, we were pretty much security. Yeah. And if you heard ER has got a patient out of control. Like, I could not get there fast enough. Like, no, I got to be there. And that feeling, it only happened a couple times. Well, I shouldn't say a couple times. It happened often, but there was a few times you could feel the difference over, like, literally over the microphone. Like, you could hear.
Yeah.
It wasn't just, hey, I need backup. It was one in particular case. I won't go into all the details. So, but basically, he was in a part of town that you did not go to by yourself on the weekends when there was a couple hundred drunk people there. And there was a person down, and the first officer arrived, and he was a rookie, and he wasn't unkeying his mic. So literally, he's like, yeah, this is so-and-so. I need, get the fuck back. And he's like, you could hear him yelling into the crowd. And I was like, oh, like, I was literally pulling on the steering wheel, like trying to stand on the gas pedal. I was like, I got to get there quicker. Or I think the scariest, though, was another officer, a really good friend of mine, was chasing a guy. He's like, oh, I'm in foot pursuit from a car stop. And then literally silence. And I was the next senior person, and I was like, you get the National Guard, you get everybody online, like, right now to come out look for. And realistically, it could have been a bad situation. His radio had fallen off while he was running. So that's what it was. But I'll tell you, it was 120 seconds of pure terror for everybody that was on duty and rushing to the scene, because we just lost him. Like, you know, there was dead silence on the air. And that was probably, other than the few situations I've been in personally, one of the most god-awful, terrifying situations I've ever been through in my life. Is your buddy there's dead silence when you're calling if he needs, like, where's location? Are you hurt? What's going on? And nothing. And that was truly like, oh my God. So now we made fun of him when we got there, when we knew he was safe.
Well, yeah, naturally.
Oh, yeah. And I think it's hard for people not in our worlds or have been in our shoes to understand that gallows humor and how important it really is to us. And that's something truly I miss and I hate about the world right now, where if you say anything, they don't like it, people feel they have the right to bitch. It's like, nah, unless you're here with me, let's, like, take a step back and let us say or do what we're doing, you know, within certain bounds, I guess. But it's truly hard for someone to understand that the person you were just about to start crying in your car because you thought they were hurt, that as soon as you see them, you're like, Jesus, you're a pansy. You lost your radio? Like, what's going on? So, yeah, it was a great life. I loved it. But, you know, I get to help people now. I had one of the very first patients was a little girl, call me doctor. And again, I normally try and tell people, no, I'm your nurse practitioner, just because I work closely with a couple doctors, you know, I just want that division, just so they know. It's like a respect thing. But she was like, oh, you're my favorite boy doctor. I was like, oh, thank you. And she drew me, or she had colored in like a picture and handed it to me. And I was like, oh, I just wanted to hug her and, like, pick her up. Just like, oh, you're amazing. So I can't say that I don't love what I do now. I just, I guess it's got to be like if you have two kids. I only have one kid, but if you have two kids, like, you could love them both a lot. Except for my parents, they probably picked me because I'm obviously the best of the family.
They picked your sister.
You know, for other people, but other people probably have that same thing where they can love two things so much. Yeah. So
you're right. It's a different feeling. Like, I don't have that camaraderie now with my colleagues that I had in EMS, and I'm still friends with my old partners. I mean, they were my first guests on my podcast. I called them up and was like, hey, we haven't talked in a while. You're coming on my podcast. Let's tell me about our craziest stories together. And we got an officer down call, and you're right. It was just heart-stopping. It ended up being a hostage standoff, and the police officer was not injured because they thought he had been shot at, but they missed. And this guy barricaded himself inside a house with his girlfriend and his mother, and it ended up being this whole thing where the SWAT team got called. We were on a SWAT standby, and I had actually just gotten back from AIT, the Army Job School for combat medic, and the SWAT team was posted up on all the fire trucks, and I ended up running in with the SWAT team as they're throwing flashbang grenades. And I'm not a tactical medic at all.
Oh, that's a rush, isn't it?
That was incredible. And my partner was like, the grenades were going off, and he's like, what is that? I'm like, they're flashbangs. Keep going, because we did that in medic school for the Army, like that's what you do. And we get in there, and there's just smoke everywhere. And this guy, he released the hostages, but he tried to kill himself by cutting everything. Oh my god, his arm was like, you pick up like a wet sponge that's like completely impregnated with water. That was his arm with blood because he just tried to cut everything.
Nice.
But we bandaged him up, and we got fluids running into his bicep because that was the only line you can get on him. He also tried to cut his jugulars, and we extricated him through the windows, and we're like all over the news, and you could see us, and like it was like, oh, I just ran into a hostage standoff with a SWAT team. Well, that was fun.
Oh, yeah.
My hair looked okay.
See, I'm bald, so I don't have to worry about that stuff. It's funny because I'm actually a level 1 hostage certified negotiator, and I remember when I think the chief was just trying to get me away from the station for a week, to be completely honest. Because I remember when he was like, "Hey Tom, you and so and so and so and so are going to hostage." I was like, "Me?"
He picked up hostage standoffs.
Yeah, and I was like, well, because I was voted most likely the guy to go, like, pick up the phone. Hey, let him go. And when they said no, okay, well, let's go shoot him. Like, they were like, nah, Tom, you don't want to let that guy go do this. But I learned a lot. It was a great school. However, it led me to a funny story that you just reminded me of. One of the videos they showed us was from a hostage standoff. EMS was arriving on scene because the officer had got shot. And EMS goes, oh, the scene's not secure. It literally is backing away from the officer who is running towards the EMS.
Oh, no.
Like, oh, yeah. And this like whole thing got burned into my memory. And I literally, when I got back, I went to every paramedic and was like, if I'm shot and you drive away from me, you had better fucking keep going because I will fucking kill you. So you had better.
I'm going to shoot your tires out.
You better hope I bleed out before I get into that ambulance. So, yeah, I mean, and I, again, totally understand scene security, though much props to you. If out there listening have never experienced a flashbang.
I have.
Wow.
Boy, is that fun.
Yeah, that is a experience right there to go through one of those things. So
I actually got to experience a flashbang as the bad guy in the house because
oh jeez.
And so it was the SRT team, and so they're like, they come in and they tackle you and handcuff you and all that good stuff, practicing. And they go out and they say, hey, we're going to flashbang you this time. And I'm like, yeah, okay, whatever, guys. And they weren't kidding. So I'm in the living room hiding, and I hear tink, roll, and then I hear just, boof.
Yeah, it's like it's like if a camera flash had a noise. Like, oh my god, I can't see or hear anything now. Oh yeah, those things are incredible. They're so much fun. But yeah, here's the funny thing is like once they go off, everybody knows you're there. I remember barricading a scene, and boom, like 2 or 3 flashbangs go off. The windows are shattered, everything's gone. They're running into the scene, and literally the rookie next to me, because we had been on like pretty much radio quiet. Because it was like 4 a.m. We didn't want anybody to know we were walking up to the scene. And he's like, do you think we could do anything now? I'm like, I'm pretty sure they know we're here. You can go ahead and turn your radio up now. But it's just funny it's funny looking back though. Like, I guess it goes to training. Like, he went to what he knew. And what he knew was he was supposed to stay quiet. I'm like, no. Now it's okay. Let's go. But it's funny how when people are in their first stressful situation, you watch them. And then it's like, oh, is that how I acted? Well, to be fair, I know that's how I acted. I remember the first time I went on a call where you're supposed to pull out your gun. I walked up, everybody else has their gun out. I'm like, oh yeah, I have one of those. And I pulled it out, and drew down, and it was something. But it's funny when you look back.
Well, looking back on that actual same hostage standoff, we were posted up as EMS, and we're things you don't know from the movies about hostage standoffs is like you guys know as cops is that they have to give so many warnings before they can just go in guns blazing and like throw flashing lights at people. And so we're like camped out for like a couple hours, and they're like, give yourself up and do all this stuff. And so we're just like, fuck, this is so boring. And we're eating Twizzlers and sitting on the stretcher. Like, it was a nice night. And they're like, you're not undercover. And I was like, oh yeah. Like, that was so dumb. Like, we had a good view, and like we were really far away, but like if he had like a rifle, he could shoot you, and you're like, oh, I'm stupid. Like, what the hell is wrong with me? Like, it wasn't like right like next to his window peeking in, but I was like, you idiot. Take your Twizzlers and go behind the fire truck. Dumbass.
One of the only times I remember, like I was like, oh my god, this is gonna suck. So we lived in a neighborhood that was, I shouldn't say neighborhood, in a city that was, it was real rough. I mean, it was much rougher than you would expect. For if I told you where, you'd just like, no, you think of grasslands and nothing, and it was actually a really rough town. And we got shots fired, like seriously, I maybe every other night for a while. I mean, it was just a rough town, and we're going to this shots fired call, okay, units responding, blah, blah, blah. And then it's like, hey, we got a second report. So I'm like, okay, well, that's a little more safe. By about the fourth report, I'm like, okay, I don't think this is firecrackers now, like here we go. But the thing that got my attention, it's something you just said, was the last caller in said, hey, I own an SKS, and that guy is holding an SKS or an AK-47. And I'm like, well, that is just what I wanted to fucking hear, rolling up to the scene. So this guy's got a weapon that could touch me in 500 yards, and yeah. I'm like a city block away. I'm like, yeah, this is going to be super fucking fun rolling up to this scene. So, so it's funny when you say that, like you just think back and you're like, all the dumb things that I've lived through. Like, oh, geez, yeah, here we go.
Well, just going on tangents about guns, when I had a mental health patient who, this person believed that, okay, so a lot of delusions here, that I'm trying to remember the exact story, but for some reason it was a mental health emergency and came in as him and Bruce Willis were going to kill all the white people, I think.
Nice.
Samuel L. Jackson, Die Harder. That's no, what you're thinking
of. No. I mean, I don't know what I'm thinking of, but no, this guy, it was like him and Bruce Willis, white man Bruce Willis, were going to kill all the white people. And we're like, okay, great. With like a Chinese cookbook. And you're like, got it. And
I like where this is going.
This was a white gentleman. And so police had secured the scene, and they're like, go look in there. And we walk in, and there's a dozen samurai swords, and then probably 10 different rifles. There was like AKs, there was ARs, I was going to say M16s, but no, there was a bunch of ARs and stuff, and just all the, like some old Russian rifles that I didn't know what they were or if they even worked. But you're just like, how did you get all these swords? And all these rifles that were not legal in the state that we were in, obviously. But it was just like, oh shit. Like, this is a city block, and we parked around the corner, but like, a lot of times for mental health patients, we would just kind of go on our own, but he could have just lit us up as we were walking in, and it's amazing that he didn't.
Complacency is a bitch.
I mean, we did the right things and we didn't die, but
yeah, the closest, I shouldn't say the closest I got to dying. The closest I got to dying by getting shot, let's put it that way, was a guy. I responded to a burglary alarm, a business burglary alarm, right? So it's this big open parking lot area. It's raining cats and dogs. And I'm pulling up, and I see this guy walking away. And it's a guy I have arrested a dozen times. I still remember his date of birth, his social, from all the times I had to process him. I mean, that's how many times I arrested this guy. And I'm like, hey, stop. And he keeps walking. I'm like, stop, or I'm going to arrest you for obstruction. And honestly, all I wanted to ask him was, had he seen anyone else in the area? Because it was a hardware store. And I was like, this dude was not going to a hardware store. Like, that's not what he's going to rob. I was like, I could give a crap less. I just wanted to see if he had seen anybody else. And he keeps walking, and he keeps walking. So finally I stop. I get out of my car, and I'm like, God damn it, because it's pouring. And I start walking up, and the guy turns around. He's got his hands in his pocket. Now, up until this point, I'd been totally casual with him. But something in my head said, get your hands out of your pockets. And what he did, there was a gun. And he was, it ended real quick. Luckily, his intoxication level made him a lot slower. And the barrel of a 45 SIG in his face, brought him to the light. But, I mean, we were literally probably within 2 arms lengths of each other. It happened that quick. And I felt so complacent, like I should have never, there's so many things I didn't do right. And if, it could have been easily, a funeral. And I was like, oh my God, so again, I understand, you get to that point where you're like, and this is one of the things I'm afraid of as a nurse practitioner, because I'm still new. I'm still very new, is that, 5 years from now, I'm going to be like, oh, I know everything. Like, God, I don't ever want to get to that level.
Yeah, I'm afraid of that too, like clinical complacency. But just kind of going back to the police thing, it was always really interesting for me to see cops on medicals, like cops when they got there first, because I worked in an urban area where there was tons of ambulances. Our response times were great. We were under 6 minutes for everything. Usually 2 to 4 minutes was our response time, but still it was 2 to 4 from dispatch. So cops usually got the call first, and they were everywhere in these cities. So there was a couple of times where police, they were doing CPR first, they were doing interventions first, and they were just first responders, if that. I remember one time, and this will always just stick out of my head. It was probably one of like the most endearing things ever. The city cop, and this is right around Boston, so thick accent, jarhead looking guy, like huge, ripped Marine kind of cop with a thick Boston accent. We roll up on scene for a PD seizure, and he comes just booking it out of the house carrying this 2-year-old little girl that's just limp in his arms. And he goes, she's pale, but she's breathing, and he just throws her at me, and he goes, she was having a seizure and she stopped breathing, and she still had a pulse, but she just wasn't breathing at all. And this is like all in one breath. And so then I breathed for her, and I gave her a couple of breaths, and then she started breathing again, and she's coughed, and now she looks pinker. Do you think I did the right thing? Is she okay? Is she going to live? And it was a cop that was experienced, but he was just so concerned about her, and he cared so much about this little girl, and like it was just so sweet, and he saved her life. He really did, because I think she probably choked on something and aspirated and had stopped breathing after the seizure, but it was so sweet. So you had actually, I'm going to toss this back to you. You said there was a moment that kind of made you want to be a nurse. What was that?
So like I said, it was more of a cracks in the dam, like multiple things that just happened. And I was already kind of, I just had a real knack. And I think Ben, like I said, we're from the same area. I think he can back this up. I had a real knack for being at the wrong place at the wrong time for like every bad call. Mm-hmm. And it was just, I was a young guy. I was in the early 20s, and it was starting to weigh on me. And that's something at the time I thought down on myself. I think that was that bravado, like, stop being a pussy. Like, you're a police officer. You can't be like this. And now I look back and go, dude, that's some mental strain we need to be more cognizant of. But
oh yeah, I had that too.
I think the final night, there was a final night. Like I said, there was multiple things, and if we ever do this again, like I said, I have 1,000 stories. But the final night, I was actually a deputy at the time, and because I'd worked for both the county and the city, and I was just coming on duty. The young lady I was dating at the time wanted to do a ride along, so we were both walking out to my patrol car, and they said, "There's a house fire in town, possibly 2 people inside." And so I gave my call number. I said, "County, I'm on duty. I'm en route." And I was like, "If you want to come, get in the car or go inside." But I'm like, "We're going now." So she jumped in the car. Mm-hmm. I jumped in the car. We go, lights the sirens to this call. And we get to this house. And it is fully engulfed. And I try and tell people, like, if you look at charcoal briquettes, and they've been in the bottom of your grill, and they start to get that white color, like, that's what the inside of the house looked like. It was going. Yeah. And, I see the cops down on the side, and I'm like, okay, I'm putting my patrol car in position to block off traffic for fire. And I start running up, and both the parents are outside. And later on, we had found out that each parent thought the other parent had the children.
Oh, God.
When they had got outside. And so I find the officers on the side of the house, and I run up, and there was a couple windows, and I took my flashlight out, and I hit one of the windows and broke it out. And of course, firefighters and everybody else would be like, "Oh, that's stupid." I'm sure they would, because I ended up cutting the shit out of my arm. But I reached in, and I was trying to get stuff out of the way. There was something in the way, and I ended up just grabbing a hold of whatever it was, and I yanked an entire dresser through a window. I was like, "Wow, that's pretty cool," So like threw this thing on the ground, and we're helping this other officer up, and we both reach in, and he got one of the kids out. And I was like, "Oh, God, okay." So, he runs her over to paramedic. I'm like, okay. So me and this other officer, he's like, there's one more. There's one more. And me and these other officers, I remember everybody that was there. I just don't want to say any names, but we're all there, and I'm screaming into this window that might as well be a black velvet curtain. Like, this smoke is just pouring out, and I am screaming at the top of my lungs this kid's name. And like, just nothing. I'm reaching around. I actually took my duty belt off. I will say a certain assistant chief probably saved my life because I was going in the house. I'd dropped my duty belt. I was like, that's it. Like, I'm going in. And this guy literally grabbed me. He's like, fire is almost here. Like, you cannot go into that house. And firemen got there. They set up these positive pressure fans. And within a couple seconds, we could see a foot under a bed. And one of the firemen were there. And so finally, me and him argued for a second. He's like, we can't go in yet. And I said, well, you're going or I'm fucking going. But someone's going. And finally, I actually threw him through a window. And he went in there.
Firefighter?
Yeah, like it was already broke out. Like I know the guy.
Yeah.
He's a great guy. Well, he's a little guy, so I actually tossed him through the window because adrenaline's pumping. And
he's got turnout gear on. So.
Yes. He's perfectly safe, right? So I throw him through a window, and he brings the little guy out, and he didn't make it. And I went out to the ER, and they had already life flighted the first one out. And I walk in, and I mean, I know now there was intubation and IO and all the stuff going on. And I see the ER nurses, and I see myself, and I'm like covered in soot. And I felt, for lack of a better, I don't know what other way to say it, I felt like completely helpless. And everything else that had left this moment, I was like, I will never feel this way again. I will never be in this position. And I literally walked back up to my car and said, I'm going to nursing school. Bam, it was done. I made that decision that second. I had to do something so I could help people. That's what I wanted to do as a police officer.
Holy shit.
I had made the decision that's what I was going to do. And literally within a week, I had grabbed my application. I talked to Ben and said, hey, I need a reference. And, we went down that road. And it was a long, hard, it was an associate program, and it was hard. I worked all night as a police officer. Then I'd go to school all day and fit in clinicals somehow. And it was a rough time, but I'm glad I did it.
Yeah. Wow. That's a story.
Yeah. You know, Tom, you and I have a mutual friend, James, that we kind of bag on for the show because it's funny sometimes. But your story kind of sounds a lot like his to an extent. He helped me through, as a provider, I'd lost a young patient. She was in her 20s. And was it like a family member? And, so I had seen her because she wasn't feeling well and ordered some lab work and had wanted to do an EKG and a sono. And they had said, oh, well, she's graduating college next week. I'm sure it's just stress. And so I kind of, okay, yeah, I'm sure that's probably what it is. You're right. And her mom called me on a Friday night and said she's down at the bar and they're doing CPR. I'm like, okay, I'm sure, they're non-medical, so maybe they're just misunderstood. And so I said, call me as soon as you know something. And I didn't get a phone call. I waited up several hours. Didn't get a phone call. Woke up the next morning, got a message that said, call me from her. And so I called her and she said she didn't make it. And so I beat myself up really bad. As an ER nurse, and, I could tell hundreds of stories of deaths in the ER. But as an ER nurse, we compartmentalize that really well. And, as a provider, that transitions. And you're that final, it's your final say to an extent. Whereas with an ER nurse, you can say, oh, well, it was the doctor. Or to make it better for you, I guess.
Yeah.
And so I beat myself up really hard for a while. And he sent me a message one day and he said, there's 3 types of patients in this world. And he said, the first type is they're going to live no matter what you do. The second type is they're going to die no matter what you do. And the third type is the people that you can really help. He said, so what you have to do is you have to stop focusing on the first and the second types and you need to focus on the third type. And so I'm like, well, man, how'd you get so wise? And he said, basically he was in the military and he was in an infantry type unit and had friends die in front of him. And it was this feeling of he didn't know what to do. And he said the exact same thing that you said, Tom, that will never happen to him again. He will never be in a position where he doesn't know what to do. And so that's why he went and got his nurse degree and now his nurse practitioner degree. And it's that feeling of not wanting to feel that way. But those 3 patients, he told me that 3 years ago, I think, 2 or 3 years ago. And it still sits with me, like 3 types of patients in this world. And so when I do have a patient that I lose, that's kind of where I go back to is, it's three types of patients.
Well, and it's something I'm trying to hold on to because I am still very much in that beginning phase. Like I said, I'm still a new nurse practitioner. I still have the Superman syndrome. Like, I'm going to save everybody. And I think it's smart and it's completely true. Like, us as nurse practitioners, that's how we have to view the world. When I was an ER nurse, I thought, nope. Well, I think there was only two types of patients. The ones I was going to save were the ones that were dead before they got here. Like, EMS Christine was going to bring me this guy and that was going to be on my lap because she was going to do that out in the field. But to be fair, like, now, if you brought him into the ER, I was going to save you. And I had a real struggle a lot of times as an ER nurse and as an ICU nurse. Because I worked at an ICU and a trauma or a level 2 trauma center. Like, we saw some bad stuff. And, like, I always had this inclination that I had to do everything. And I think as a provider, that's just too much. There's too much going on. And you're right. You have to kind of focus on what you can do or how you can do it. And I don't know, Miss Christine, have you have any thoughts in that area?
I think the 3 patients they're so true. I think I learned it in EMS. You know, there's a lot of times where you're going to work your ass off and you're going to try and do everything you can and they're just going to die in front of you and you're going to pretend that they're alive underneath your hands, but they're dead and you're just kind of doing it until someone else tells you they're dead, which was how it would go in EMS. As a provider, you're the one kind of making the pronouncements. You're also going to fuck up because you can't know everything and you can't have infinite wisdom. And I say pretty openly, I had some really rough calls in EMS, and I talk openly about mental health on my podcast for first responders and paramedics because of it. I had some really horrific nightmares, which I still have really, really horrific nightmares from EMS. But when I have really difficult cases, when I feel like I'm a little bit overwhelmed, I remember the really good ones. I remember the times when that third category of patient where I did save them. And I like the times when I know, like, that feeling that I saved somebody's world. And I guess I'll tell a story to kind of go out on a good note.
Please.
Yeah. I was like, how am I going to pull this back around? I hope she's got the steering wheel on this. Jesus Christ.
Yeah, right? So, and we were working BLS, very inner city. English was not the primary language of this city. We didn't go places at night alone to certain stores because it was just gangs, and even in uniform you were a target. But I remember I used to work 16 on, 8 off, and then 16 on. And of course with commuting, like, you just really didn't get much sleep. So if you got out on time that first shift. And so this was the second 16 in this city, and it was like probably an hour and a half before the end of the shift. I was exhausted. We had just been run all day long, and I was working with a partner who was really experienced too, and we were just kind of zoning out in that haze you take on these horrible base couches that have rats running underneath them, right? You can hear them in the summertime, and we get a call for a baby not breathing, and we don't even speak. The way this city worked is we heard it through the fire department radios, and we didn't get dispatched through fire. We got dispatched through our own dispatch. Sometimes we would talk to fire, but this case we didn't. Usually you wait because they would maybe send another ambulance, but we knew we were the only one, and we didn't wait for anybody. We just flew. I drove. I drove really fast. We were probably there in
the flux capacitor kicked on.
Oh, God. And we had not even said a word to each other, my partner and I. We were there in probably 30 seconds from when we actually pulled out. And I had been in EMT for 7 years at this point, more. Nothing really fazed me. But I barely put the truck in park. I don't know. It's just one of those things, you knew that it was bad. And I could feel myself shaking as I was putting my gloves on, because the first thing I saw was just a baby on the sidewalk and underneath all these like big apartment buildings, and all these adults were standing around, but no one was touching the baby. And it wasn't right in my mind. Like, what's wrong? Did it fall? Something? So my partner went and grabbed all the stuff, and I just went right to this kid. And this infant was probably 7 or 8 months old, and no one spoke any English. So we don't really know, but somehow we found out that it didn't fall, that it stopped breathing, and they panicked. And so they just came down to meet the ambulance, and no one knew what to do. So they just put the baby on the ground because they're panicking. And so the first thing I did was my assessment, right? And I picked the baby up, and you put a baby on the ground, and they got that big baby head, and it just impedes the airway. It closes it off. So just by opening the airway, the baby kind of gasped a little bit, but pulse was like really thready, barely anything. And so we just get it in the ambulance, and we beat the fire department, who was like 2 blocks away. Those guys were slow. I don't know what the hell they were doing. They were smooth.
Coffee and Danish. That's what those guys are always waiting on.
It was like 10 o'clock at night, and they must have their CPAPs on already. And I love you, fire department. So we get him in the truck, and we just start working the code. And kids are they're airway, and we're bagging him, we're stimulating, we're doing like 2 rounds of CPR, and he just starts to cry. And mom wasn't there. Mom was working the late shift, and the paramedic truck shows up from who the fuck knows where. They just showed up. Like, we had called for them. But my partner and I didn't say a word to each other. And we bagged him, and we got the pulses became stronger. And, you know, he's doing okay, but he's still pretty critical. And we just start driving to this major hospital in Boston, the closest one that was there. And so we'd done our CPR, and mom didn't understand. She finally got there, and she didn't speak English, and my Spanish is no bueno. So I'm driving. She's looking in the back. She's trying to look at her baby, but we didn't want her in the back because the last thing we want is freaking out mom looking at this infant in case it codes again. And there wasn't that much room. So she had not heard the baby kind of making some noises. And so as we get to the hospital, they had been giving him enough oxygen and just assisting with ventilations as they needed to. He actually perks up a lot, and he starts to cry. And we didn't speak the same language, but mom looks at the crying baby, and I go, yeah, it's good. It's good. And she just starts to cry, and she hugs me. And baby lived. I don't know why he stopped breathing, and I don't know why he coded, but baby lived. And every time I have something really shitty, I just remember getting hugged by that mom that didn't speak the same language. But we all know that a crying baby is a breathing baby, so that was good. So yeah, you just hold on to that.
That is a good story. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And then you just kind of like, yeah, you have a call like that. You're like, yeah, I did that. And then you just walk off. You're like, holy fuck, what just happened?
Yeah, it's that adrenaline dump of, do I want to go run 6 miles, or do I want to go throw up in the corner?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's amazing how I never, not as a nurse, not as a police officer, times I almost died, no matter what. Like, during the moment, you feel like cold steel, right? People are like, oh, are you okay? You're like, yeah. And then, like, you're off of yourself, and you're like, holy fuck. And you just want to throw up everywhere. Down. Yeah. It's
when it comes down.
That adrenaline dump is no joke. If there's people out there that have not experienced that, man, that is, it's something. It really is. But no, that is such a great story. And I try and hold on to those things when the, things get their darkest. So I thank you for telling that, because man, we needed a damn pick me up. I feel like I was like the Ativan of conversation there. Like, after that, I was like, okay,
it's okay.
Well, yeah.
Well, welcome to my podcast. This is what I do every week.
Oh, so
you guys talk about billing codes.
Yeah. But we also cuss a lot and talk about falling space debris. So yeah. I mean, we try and make it a little more happy, but sometimes. Man, the subject matter is just, well, for us, I think that's an interesting thing, like, to talk about our different podcasts. Is that's one of the things with our podcast is sometimes we get like a really fun episode, like alcohol or weird medical stories. Those you can kind of spin, and I think our crowd or people that listen to us know, like, we're going to cuss a lot. We're probably going to be slightly inappropriate, but not too bad. But we're going to try to make things as lively as we can. But we also want to cover relevant medical information. And when we talked about billing, I was like, how the fuck are we going to make billing fun? Like,
but it's so important.
It is extremely important. But I'm like, we're also here to, like, keep people entertained, and I just don't see it. Billing, it's hard.
That was the Ativan of conversation, but hey, it worked.
I've had a blast, Christine. I gotta be honest, I really have.
This was fun. I'm sure we could just tell first responder stories forever, but that would be a long ass podcast.
yeah. I would say, honestly, you made me realize that maybe sometime soon we do. I think we've had some specialty NP episodes we've been thinking about or working on. The mental health thing is truly something, and not just for patients. I'll be honest. I guess if you want to self-diagnose with PTSD, there was an incident that to this day, there's one day a year, like I'm a wreck. 13 years later, I'm still like, nope, my brain just does not do well on that day. So it's amazing the mental health aspect of how things work and what it can do to you. So I'm just super happy that we can look back on these stories though, and something fruitful came out of it. Like some people go down that road and they just don't get off of it. And I think all of us are examples of, you can use that as the fuel for the fire to improve yourself and do something more, or as the excuse to just wallow and do nothing more. So I guess big ups to us. I don't know. Like, there you go. Like, yay for us.
There are many ways to solve a problem, and these are just 3 ways. So hopefully they're semi-healthy ways.
Yeah, I was gonna say for like 6 months, my way was the bottom of like Jim Beam or Jack Daniel bottle. So that's not the way I would tell people that they need to deal with their issues in the world.
God. Oh, let me tell you about cheap wine. Yeah.
Do you have a particular brand? Because mine was Long Island iced teas, but if I was at home by myself, it was Jim Beam usually, or Jack Daniels.
Oh, it was like any kind of like cheap under $10 bottle of wine would be like my EMS, drown my sorrows kind of thing. I was also in a shitty marriage since divorced, but like you're also in that culture. It's a culture of drinking and like fuck all. So yeah. We can keep going, but
no. Yeah. I feel very much the same way, and I know Benton has been out to the bar with me. It's just like, you know what? Fuck this. Meet me at this bar. And, that's just what you did. Or, one of the shifts I worked, every Friday night, we all met after the shift at this bar. It didn't matter if you even drank. If you just showed up and had a Coke, it didn't matter. That's where we went. Like, that was our thing. That's what we did. And you did not break the tribe. Too. Yes, exactly. So it's a very interesting thing to hear other people's take on it. Because like I said, sometimes I feel like me and Ben are the only ones that do that, because me and Ben have known each other for so long and been through so many things. And then when you say it, I'm like, I feel better about myself. There you go.
It's that brotherhood and sisterhood of first responders. When you meet someone else that even though you didn't work together, you're like, oh, you get it.
Mostly
the same culture.
Yeah, mostly that sisterhood though is the fire service. So.
Hey guys, I hope you liked that episode with Just Some Podcast. Again, you can find them anywhere you listen to podcasts, wherever you're listening to this podcast right now. Just search Just Some Podcast. And of course, reach out to them on social media as well. Please reach out to me on social media. I love hearing from you. Like I always say, please leave me some reviews. It really, really helps. If you leave a review, I'll give you a shout out. If you follow me on social media, I will follow you back. And as always, I hope you have a really great new year. I can't wait to see where this podcast will go in the new year. It's been really incredible. So thank you all so much for listening. Facebook is Antidotes Podcast Stories in Medicine. There's the Facebook group as well. Twitter is Antidotes Pod. My Twitter is Christine the NP. Instagram is Antidotes Podcast. And as always, thank you so much to Peter Hopkins for our custom music. Find him at PeteSingsThings.com. And I will see you in 2019. Have a happy, happy new year.